Thank you very much. First, I'm sure others will wish to join with me in paying tribute to Gerry, Conlon, whose death was announced since the last time we sat. And of course, he was one of the Guildford Four who was released from imprisonment in Britain and who spent the remainder of his life, it must be said, campaigning for other victims of miscarriages of justice. And I know that many of us would be very impressed by his work over those years, and just to express sympathy to his family and pay him tribute on his untimely death at the age of 60. Could I also, Clearly, ask the leader for a debate at some point on the recent report just published yesterday of the Inspectorate of Mental Health Services, looking at really the numbers of people who are in some form of institutional care under the auspices of mental health services, in what the report describes as a series of mini hostels around the state. And the report has expressed concern about some of the standards in some of the hostels, about really inconsistency of standards, and also about lack of figures, lack of availability of data. There's an estimated 1,500 people who are in this sort of care, having been released from, or having been on the closure, I should say, of the larger psychiatric units. But there's certainly still concerns about the standards in some of the smaller units. And I should say that it would be worth, I think, Leader, having a debate in this House on detention in psychiatric institutions more generally. The spotlight on the mother and baby homes in Tuam and elsewhere has told us a lot about kind of institutions of detention and confinement, but there's still a great deal to be said on institutions, on psychiatric institutions. There's some work by a Trinity colleague, Damien Brennan, Professor Barrett may know him, who has, in the School of Nursing in Trinity, who's done a really groundbreaking study of the numbers of people incarcerated in psychiatric institutions in Ireland throughout most of the 20th century. These were all state-run institutions. It doesn't raise the same issues in terms of religious orders, but it's certainly an issue that we should be looking at in this House. I'd like to have a debate on that at some point. And finally, Cahirlik, just to welcome very much the release, the announced release of Mariam Ibrahim in Sudan, who was the woman who was sentenced to death for apostasy, the Christian woman who was sentenced to death there. I'm delighted to see she's been released. There was an international campaign for her release, but I'm very saddened to see that there has been sentences of imprisonment pronounced on a series of 10 Al Jazeera journalists in Egypt. We in Shannon Éireann have been asked by the National Union of Journalists in Ireland to raise the issue of these arrests and sentences in the Shannon today, and I would certainly like to join with the NUJ in urging the Taoiseach and Minister for Foreign Affairs to condemn the abuse of human rights in Egypt and to work with governments within the EU to oppose the criminalisation and imprisonment of journalists. These were Al Jazeera journalists doing their job, and there's been some really seriously long prison sentences handed down, some of them in absentia, but at least 2 journalists who are now being sentenced to jail, immediate custodial sentences in Egypt, and I think we all should condemn that. Thank you, Gerry.